Okay, let's begin by looking at Act 1, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice. So, The Merchant of Venice is a really complex play that contains a vast number of characters and numerous plot lines. And because a lot of the plot lines are related to love, so there are numerous couples who are kind of falling in love, and it can get a bit confusing. And that's just the love stories, and then there's the kind of family feud that Shylock has with his daughter, and then there's the pound of flesh, and so many different storylines that it's absolutely essential that right at the beginning of the play here, Shakespeare establishes the main storyline, or at least begins the explanation of the main storyline. And because of that, it's actually right into, in Act 1, Scene 1, this storyline about Antonio being a merchant and lending money to Bassanio because he wants to woo Portia. We get right into it. So in other plays like Romeo and Juliet, that starts with a fight in the streets, and we don't actually meet Romeo until the very end of the scene. But in The Merchant of Venice, I think because there are so many storylines, so many characters, so much that's going to happen, it has to be established right away. That brings us into an interesting dialogue about structure of a text. How do writers, how does Shakespeare structure this text? And Aristotle, the Greek philosopher a few hundred years before Jesus, he looked at drama and he came up with some ideas in his book, The Poetics, which included theories on narrative structure. He believed that drama could be divided into three sections, and it was not until the 19th century that Gustav Freytag built on that. He's a German novelist, and he basically said that all plays, all drama falls into the five structural areas shown on the screen. And you might know it as Freytag's pyramid, or a number of things. My children call it the story mountain. But essentially, we're going to look at this throughout this series, but essentially this bit's the important bit, the exposition. Always at the beginning, we're supposed to be introduced to the setting and the main characters. Now, as I said, because there are so many different characters and plot lines in this play, it's actually over a few scenes in this opening act that we have the exposition. But Shakespeare immediately introduces, as I said, the main characters and the main plot ideas, and really establishes three things in this scene. There's a guy called Antonio. He's a successful merchant. He's a rich kind of trader. He's got a lot of money. But at the moment, all of his wealth is invested in trading ships which are at sea. So that's one of the reasons this play was set in Venice, which is a very important trading centre. Exotic goods were traded in the city. We know it as the home of the explorer Marco Polo. So he's got all of his investment. Let's say, put it into sort of current terms because it's such an old text. Let's say you have £1 million, but you invest that £1 million in a cruise ship. You buy a cruise ship, and then the cruise ship has a risk that it could sink. And if it was to sink, you would lose all of your £1 million. And that's the situation Antonio is in. He is wealthy, but all of his money is tied up in trade. We learn throughout the play that he actually has already lent Bassanio money and others, and he's helped people pay off their debts. He's a well-known trader, respected and wealthy, and we know from the fact that he's able to take a loan. Bassanio is able to take a loan just using Antonio's name as the kind of guarantee that, Antonio is a rich guy, but all of his money is tied up. Then we learn about this friend Bassanio, who's in love with a rich lady called Portia, and there's a situation where Bassanio wants to marry Portia, but he feels that he needs to borrow money to basically live a more extravagant lifestyle, get some nice new clothes, servants, that kind of thing, so that when he approaches Portia to try and woo her, get her to marry him, she's impressed by him. And Antonio wants to lend the money to Bassanio, but basically says, look, I've got none available, but if you can find somebody who can lend the money to you, we can use me, Antonio says, as a guarantor, so, we'll make sure that the debt is done in my name, because Bassanio doesn't really have a penny to his name. And that, just to put that into context, that's like me, if I wanted to buy a house, I could go to the bank and they might say, you don't have enough savings, and you don't have enough job history, but your mum and dad, since they already own their house, they can put their name on the papers as a guarantor and will lend you the money, but if you ever can't pay it back, we will take the house off your mum and dad. It's the same process, and it's still a thing that works today. When somebody can't borrow money, they'll kind of do it with someone else as a guarantor. So those are the three main things that are revealed in this scene. And as I say, they are the exposition of the major plot, which is, of course, to do with the pound of flesh. This starts the ball rolling, sets the scene, and establishes the idea that that's going to happen. And, of course, Bassanio and Portia. But it's a sign of Shakespeare's talent that these details are actually revealed by other characters, rather than have Antonio stand there and say, I am a successful merchant, but I am stressed because all of my money is at sea. That isn't what happens. Shakespeare is an artist who knows the skill of showing, not telling. And we often say to students, when you're writing a story, don't tell us something about the character, have something happen that reveals something about the character. And we get the characters of Salerio and Salanio who tell us things about Antonio. So at the beginning of the play, in Act 1, Scene 1, right at the very beginning, we learn Antonio says, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad. So Antonio opens the play saying, I'm sad, I'm depressed, and I don't know why. Now, we know this play is a comedy in genre, so that actually seems to challenge the idea of the comedy. I'll look at that in more detail in the future, the generic conventions of the comedy. But it seems to challenge that idea. Hang on a minute, this is supposed to be a comedy. Why is this guy sad? And we never really learn the reason why he's sad. Some people think maybe he's sad because he knows he's about to essentially lose his best friend Bassanio, who is pursuing a woman, and they're going through that stage that is very normal for teenage life of your best friend gets a girlfriend and then you don't see your best friend for ages. But along comes Salerio and Salanio, and they basically suggest, of course you're sad. You've got every right to be sad because all of your money is in these merchant ships on the sea, and you're stressed or worried that they're going to, crash or be robbed or sink, and you'll lose all of your money. They're a great example of a friend who tries to make things better, but ultimately makes things worse. So Salerio suggests your mind is tossing on the ocean where your argosies overpeer the petty traffickers. Now that's a sort of complex piece of language, but basically what he's saying is, you're stressed because you're worried about your ships, or you're stressed and your mind is like your ships. But don't worry about your ships because your merchant ships are huge compared to all the little boats. And through this reference to, why you might be stressed, we learn the key thing about Antonio, that his money is all invested at sea. So we learn this crucial detail through another character. And then there's even some foreshadowing, the literary device of foreshadowing where future events are hinted at, happens a lot in Shakespeare and a lot in this play. And there's some foreshadowing when his friend says, references dangerous rocks. In other words, suggesting, you might be worried because of the dangerous rocks that are going to shipwreck your ship. So it's quite interesting that they're trying to settle him, but they say, of course you're worried they might smash into these rocks. And you can imagine him sort of saying, oh, shut up, I don't want to think about that. Antonio says that's not why he's worried, and we never know as an audience. Of course, Antonio isn't the key character in this play. Critics argue that Shylock is the main character, Portia next, perhaps Bassanio next, but it's not Antonio. So he's not a completely well-rounded character where we learn everything about him. Then Bassanio comes along and Antonio asks about the pilgrimage he's wanting to take. Now, pilgrimage is a religious word. It suggests you want to go on a religious journey, a kind of journey to a religious or sacred setting or person. And that suggests, from Antonio's point of view, that he thinks Portia, the object of Bassanio's desire, is a kind of godlike presence. But Bassanio's response is fascinating. Bassanio basically talks about money. He says, my chief care is to come fairly off from great debts. And then he ends his little bit there with how clear of all the debts I owe. So he's basically saying, look, all I really care about is getting rid of the money I owe to lots of people, including you, Antonio. So whereas Antonio's mind is on, this, how's this beautiful woman, this amazing woman, Bassanio kind of says, look, I just want to get some money. And then when he starts to talk about Portia, it's even worse. Look at the structure. Shakespeare's use of structure here is so clever. The first thing he mentions about her is that she's rich. A lady richly left. He talks about her wealth. And then a little bit later on, he gets onto her looks and talks about her sunny locks. And he doesn't say anything at all about her personality. So here we have a very sad impression of Bassanio's view of Portia. Really, he wants her for her money, he wants her for her looks possibly. And even the references to her looks are steeped in very negative imagery. He talks about her hair hanging on her temples like a golden fleece. And the golden fleece is a reference to Jason and the Argonauts, a Greek myth. And this is a reference that the audience would be well aware of. Jason wanted to be king and was told that if he wanted to be king, he would have to go on this long journey to find a magical ram and to take its fleece, which was gold. Now, if we apply that to the story of the Merchant of Venice, we can see Portia is essentially the golden ram. Everybody's after her. All of her suitors are going to her on a long journey, for some of them from different countries, to try and claim her. And unfortunately, once she's married, because of the attitudes to women at the time, Bassanio will be her possessor. He will be king of that domain. Even though Portia is rich, Bassanio is going to rule over her if they get married. So we see in this reference the idea of woman as an object to be possessed. And I think it's a very negative start for Bassanio, who, is interested in money, is interested in looks, and is interested in possessing this woman. And it's a sign of Antonio's friendship that he basically says, look, I'll do whatever I can to help you. He doesn't say, don't be so ridiculous, this is stupid, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. He just wants his friend to be happy. And Bassanio goes off to try to find the money. So it's an interesting scene, and it sets up Act 1, Scene 2 really nicely, because we've heard about this woman, Portia, rich and beautiful, and seen as, she's going to be dominated by a man. And I think we imagine Portia is going to be a very weak, humble, submissive woman. But in Act 1, Scene 2, we see completely the opposite. And Shakespeare often portrayed great women in his plays. He gave them the most intelligent lines, the wittiest lines, the cleverest moments. So you can argue Shakespeare is an early feminist, challenging society's attitudes to women. A modern audience would look at this scene, though, Act 1, Scene 1, and be pretty much disgusted. But an Elizabethan audience would be well aware that this is pretty much how it is. I'll talk about the role of women in a future video, but ultimately, a woman, when she married a man, was the possession of her husband. A woman growing up would be the possession of her father, who would then pass her on to a man. And I'll go on into that kind of arranged marriage idea in the next video on Act 1, Scene 2. But in this opening scene, we see really two interesting things. We see Antonio, who seems to be sad for a reason that we never really find out about, who is a respected, wealthy man, who loves his friend Bassanio, perhaps to the extent of not quite seeing Bassanio's faults. Bassanio, we see all of his faults, and it's one of the confusing things for me. I often wonder, does Shakespeare want us to like him or not? Because obviously, spoiler alert, they do end up together, and you sort of think, well, what is Shakespeare saying? But Bassanio is childish and, obsessed with money and looks and all the rest of it. And even his sort of logic, his reasoning is quite childish. He says to Antonio that he wants to borrow more money. So he says, I've borrowed money off you before, and I want to borrow more money, because he says, what follows is pure innocence. I owe you much, and like a wilful youth that which I owe is lost. But if you please to shoot another arrow that self way which you did shoot the first, I do not doubt, as I will watch the aim, or to find both. So he's basically saying, when I was a child, if I was playing with my bow and arrow, and I lost an arrow, shot it, and off, where did that go? I could shoot another one, and then it would take me to the first one. I could follow where that one went. So you lent me money, lend me more money. but his line of argument is really childish and immature. So I don't think at all it's a positive representation of Bassanio. The audience is well aware of his faults and failings and weaknesses, and Antonio, if a nice guy, seems to be naive about Bassanio and perhaps a bit sort of weak and melancholy and depressive. And that leads beautifully into Act 1, Scene 2, which is the complete opposite when we look at the women in the play.